In this alternate timeline, the United States never enters World War I, and that absence stems not just from political will or public opinion, but from two key historical moments that, in our reality, changed everything: the sinking of the Lusitania and the interception of the Zimmermann telegram. Remove these two catalysts, and the path to war for the United States is far less clear, far more tenuous, and ultimately never taken. In 1915, the British passenger liner Lusitania was torpedoed by a German U-boat off the coast of Ireland, killing 1,198 civilians, including 128 Americans. The incident shocked the world and began shifting American public sentiment away from neutrality. Germany had declared the waters around the British Isles a war zone, and while the ship was carrying munitions, its civilian passengers became martyrs in the eyes of the American press. President Woodrow Wilson, still committed to keeping the U.S. out of the war, nonetheless warned Germany that further attacks on passenger ships would not be tolerated. In the years following the sinking, Germany briefly scaled back its submarine campaign in an effort to avoid provoking the United States further. But now imagine a world where the Lusitania was never sunk. Perhaps the U-boat missed its target. Perhaps the ship's departure was delayed. Perhaps Germany refrained from attacking it altogether. Whatever the reason, the immediate cause of the public uproar in the United States never materializes. Without this galvanizing event, isolationist sentiment remains dominant. The American people, already skeptical of the war in Europe, remain unshaken by grief or outrage. President Wilson, lacking a mandate to escalate, stays his diplomatic course. The U.S. continues to trade with the Allies, but it does so as a neutral party, not as a future combatant. Fast forward to early 1917. Germany, desperate to end the war quickly, resumes unrestricted submarine warfare. In our timeline, this was a gamble. German leaders knew it might provoke the United States, but they believed that if they could cut off Britain's supplies and force its surrender within a few months, the risk would be worth it. This risk was compounded by a second fateful event: the Zimmermann telegram. In this infamous dispatch, Germany proposed an alliance with Mexico, offering to help it reclaim Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona if the U.S. entered the war against Germany. British intelligence intercepted the telegram and passed it to the Americans. Once published in U.S. newspapers, it ignited a storm of nationalist anger and tipped American opinion firmly toward intervention. Now remove that second spark. Suppose the British never intercept the message. Or perhaps they do, but fail to decrypt it in time, or choose not to reveal it, fearing it will expose their code-breaking capabilities. In any case, the telegram never reaches the public. Americans never learn of Germany's attempt to incite conflict on their southern border. There is no perceived existential threat to the nation. The anger, fear, and betrayal that gripped the American psyche in 1917 never emerge. In the absence of both the Lusitania tragedy and the Zimmermann telegram, the pro-war faction in the United States has no rallying cry. President Wilson, though personally sympathetic to the Allied cause, has no political cover to push for war. His 1916 campaign slogan, "He kept us out of war," remains intact. Isolationism continues to dominate American politics, particularly among Midwestern progressives and anti-imperialist Southern Democrats. The Republican opposition, still weary from the memory of the Spanish-American War and the annexation of the Philippines, finds common cause in opposing foreign entanglements. American banks may still extend loans to Britain and France, and munitions shipments may continue under the guise of neutrality. But these are matters of commerce, not of national identity or security. The U.S. Navy might increase patrols in the Atlantic to protect American shipping, but there is no declaration of war, no draft, no American expeditionary force crossing the ocean. The war remains, from the American perspective, a European affair, bloody, tragic, but not their burden to bear. The implications for American domestic politics are equally important. In our timeline, the war effort accelerated the growth of federal power, brought millions of women into the workforce, and spurred the great migration of African Americans to northern industrial cities. The Espionage Act, the Sedition Act, and the rise of the surveillance state were direct responses to wartime fears. Without U.S. entry into the war, none of this unfolds. America remains less centralized, more regionally divided, and politically less radicalized. Wilson may still push for a League of Nations, but without American blood spilled on European soil, his appeals to global leadership ring hollow. In this world, the United States never undergoes its first great test as a global military power. It does not forge the alliances, logistical systems, and ideological identity that came with wartime mobilization. It remains a rising but cautious power, economically robust, geographically isolated, and politically hesitant to impose its will beyond the Western Hemisphere. The war ends without it, and the shape of the peace reflects that absence. And so, with just two events averted, the torpedoing of a ship and the transmission of a telegram, the United States avoids the defining conflict of the early 20th century. The guns fall silent in Europe, not because America intervenes, but because the weary European powers, left to their own devices, must find their own end to the bloodshed. In doing so, they craft a different world order, one in which the United States watches from a distance, its moment of global ascendance postponed, its hands clean of European blood. In the immediate aftermath of a negotiated peace, one reached without the intervention of the United States, the European powers emerge battered, but not broken in the same way as in our timeline. The war ends not in unconditional surrender or total defeat, but in exhaustion. Germany, having withstood the Allied offensives and maintained control over key portions of the Western and Eastern fronts, secures a position of strength at the negotiating table. France and Britain, depleted of manpower, munitions, and political will, concede just enough to bring the war to an end. The terms are not a sweeping victory for any side, but rather a recalibration of borders, influence, and imperial control. Germany retains much of its pre-war territory and influence, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. Belgium may remain occupied for a time, or its neutrality may be restored under strict conditions. In the East, Germany capitalizes on the collapse of the Russian Empire by expanding its sway over newly declared buffer states, Lithuania, Ukraine, and perhaps a semi-independent Poland under German economic control. Rather than a punitive treaty, the resulting peace is pragmatic. Reparations are limited. No war guilt clause is imposed. The German military is not dismantled, but rather upheld as a bulwark against instability in the East. The monarchy remains intact, the army retains its prestige, and the public returns not to a ruined state, but to a nation triumphant in its survival. In France, the mood is bitter. Though spared occupation, the physical and psychological toll of the war lingers. The French countryside remains pockmarked with trenches and cratered battlefields. A generation of young men is lost, and national morale is low. But the absence of an American military presence and the lack of a humiliating peace mean that France focuses inward, seeking to rebuild rather than to exact vengeance. The political spectrum polarizes, with some blaming the government for not pushing harder, others grateful merely for peace. Britain, facing mounting debts and the growing strain of empire, enters a period of cautious retrenchment. The Royal Navy remains powerful, but global commitments are harder to sustain. India and parts of Africa grow more restless, having contributed soldiers and resources to a war that seems to have achieved little. Demobilization brings economic dislocation, but not collapse. Britain's political establishment, wary of revolution abroad and labor unrest at home, moves toward reform, a slow expansion of social safety nets and labor rights meant to preempt radicalism. In Central Europe, Germany becomes the nucleus of a new continental bloc. The war has proven the value of centralized logistics, rail, and industrial production. German planners and diplomats begin shaping a sphere of economic cooperation, Mitteleuropa, not by conquest, but by treaties and investments in surrounding regions. Austria-Hungary, weakened but not dismembered, continues to limp along, though nationalist tensions remain unresolved. The empire endures a few more years, perhaps a decade, before eventually fracturing not from war, but from internal stagnation. Russia remains the great question mark. The Bolshevik Revolution has thrown the country into chaos, but with no Western intervention and no German surrender, the Civil War plays out differently. German aligned forces may carve out buffer zones in the Baltics and Ukraine. The Red and White armies continue to battle, but without the existential threat of a foreign invasion or international blockade, the outcome is more uncertain. The conflict may drag on for years, creating a vacuum in the East, a war-torn region where political ideologies remain in flux and where no single vision for governance fully consolidates. In the United States, the effects of non-involvement are complex. Without the unifying crisis of war, the divisions within American society persist. Industrial expansion continues, but the massive wartime boom does not occur. The women's suffrage movement advances more gradually. Racial tensions in the South and the urban North remain unresolved, lacking the demographic shifts and military service pressures that in our timeline forced a national reckoning. American politics remain more isolationist, and the country's financial system, while strong, does not dominate the global economy as quickly or completely. Culturally, the absence of a shared wartime experience delays the United States' transformation into a cohesive, modern nation-state. The lost generation of writers and artists still emerges, but their work reflects a nation watching the world's suffering from a distance. Universities, industries, and institutions that, in our timeline, were shaped by wartime priorities take longer to evolve. America remains confident and prosperous, but its trajectory is more inward, more segmented by region and class. Internationally, diplomacy resumes with an emphasis on great power equilibrium. No League of Nations is created, or if it is, it functions merely as a symbolic forum for discussion, lacking authority or enforcement mechanisms. Secret treaties, spheres of influence, and imperial rivalries once again become the tools of statecraft. Without the moral framework imposed by Wilsonian ideals, the world order defaults to pragmatic realpolitik. Over the next decade, Europe experiences a fragile peace. The major powers, wary of another conflict, avoid direct confrontation, but unresolved issues remain. Ethnic tensions in the Balkans simmer. New borders in Eastern Europe, drawn hastily during the waning days of war, spark resentment. Economic reconstruction proves difficult without the injection of American capital and the security of a stable peace. Some regions modernize rapidly, others spiral into political crisis. And then, as the 1920s progress, the consequences of a compromised peace begin to surface. Populations disillusioned by the failure to achieve meaningful change, soldiers who fought in vain, workers left behind by industrial stagnation, youth seeking identity in a chaotic world, begin turning toward radical ideologies. They seek new answers in old myths, new visions rooted in cultural revival, strength, and unity. These movements are not born in the shadow of defeat, but in the murky terrain of uncertainty. In Germany, France, Italy, and even in parts of the British Empire, nationalist and authoritarian movements gain followers. not driven by revenge, but by a hunger for order and purpose. The absence of the United States during the First World War forestalls one crisis, but it seeds another. A generation raised without resolution inherits a Europe reshaped by ambiguity, neither conquered nor liberated, neither stable nor truly broken. The old empires still stand, but their foundations crack beneath them. The ideological battles of the 20th century begin to take shape, not as a reaction to foreign occupation, but as a response to the question every society must answer after trauma. If the old ways failed to bring peace, what should rise in their place? As the 20th century unfolds from this altered beginning, the long-term consequences of the United States staying out of World War I reverberate far beyond the battlefield and the boardroom. The very architecture of the modern world, its alliances, economies, ideologies, and global institutions, shifts course. The absence of American intervention in the Great War does not prevent further conflict. Instead, it changes the character and geography of what follows. The world today, shaped by a very different century, emerges colder, more fragmented, and less driven by universal ideals. Without American intervention, the power balance in Europe remains tilted toward a German-led continental order. The British and French empires, unable to impose a punitive peace, maintain their holdings longer, but at a cost. Lacking American loans and post-war investment, they struggle under economic stagnation. Decolonization movements are delayed, but when they do erupt, they are more violent and less diplomatically contained. India's push for independence meets heavier resistance, resulting in prolonged unrest and potential regional fragmentation. In Africa, revolts spark without the international attention or moral pressure that US-led global discourse later provided. Germany, meanwhile, becomes a stabilizing core in a conservative Europe. Its empire, economy, and prestige survive the war, and its political evolution veers away from republicanism toward a corporatist or autocratic model. Without a Versailles Treaty to fuel a sense of victimhood, extremist ideologies still emerge, but they lack the emotional catalyst of defeat. Germany consolidates influence through infrastructure, trade pacts, and military partnerships across Eastern and Central Europe. Instead of a blitzkrieg strategy and continental conquest, it exerts pressure diplomatically and economically, fashioning a German-centric alternative to Western liberal capitalism. The absence of the Second World War as we know it has profound effects. Nuclear development still takes place, but more slowly and less coordinated. Without the Manhattan Project and the pressure of global war, nuclear weapons emerge over a longer timeline, possibly tested first in the late 1950s or early 1960s, perhaps by Britain, Germany, or even a rising Japan. Their use, however, is less likely to debut in a grand finale of global war. Instead, they serve as tools of deterrence among a handful of great powers, intensifying a cold, distrustful global atmosphere. The Cold War in this timeline is not fought between the United States and the Soviet Union, but likely between rival European blocs, perhaps a German-led alliance of industrialized states, and a loose Anglo-French coalition struggling to hold together the old world order. Russia's future remains chaotic. If Bolshevism collapses, Russia may become a militarized nationalist state, or balkanize entirely. In either case, it becomes a wildcard power rather than a superpower. Ideological conflict still arises, but it lacks the neat binary of capitalism versus communism. Instead, the ideological spectrum is broader, with competing forms of authoritarian capitalism, managed democracy, and nationalist corporatism defining global politics. The United States, now having avoided both world wars, continues its rise, but it does so more slowly and without the moral mandate of saving the world. Its economy remains strong, especially during the interwar years, But the Great Depression, unmitigated by the global economic ties of war reconstruction, hits harder and lasts longer. Lacking the Keynesian tools learned during the New Deal and wartime mobilization, the American response is more hesitant, more conservative. Social programs develop later. The cultural modernization of the 20th century, civil rights, feminism, counterculture, emerges more fitfully, often locally instead of nationally. America's global position is less hegemonic. It is one of several powers, not the power. It plays a key role in the Western Hemisphere, dominates North and Central America, and influences trade globally. But it does not establish NATO, does not orchestrate Bretton Woods, and does not project military bases across the globe. Its soft power, Hollywood, pop culture, tech innovation, still spreads, but more through commerce than ideology. The dollar remains important, but it shares global reserve status with the British pound, the German mark, and potentially the yen. Technology also diverges. Without the war-driven innovation spurts of the 1940s, advances in radar, aviation, computing, and rocketry occur on different timelines. Space exploration, for example, is not catalyzed by a superpower rivalry. The moon landing may be decades away, or never occur at all in the 20th century. Satellites, GPS, and the Internet, while still plausible, emerge more slowly, often developed by civilian industries rather than military R&D. Medicine, lacking the urgency of battlefield trauma, lags behind in antibiotics and surgical innovation. The modern political landscape reflects these differences. The European Union, if it forms at all, does so not as a peace project in the wake of a Second World War, but perhaps as a defensive economic alliance to counterbalance German hegemony or Anglo-French conservatism. Its mission is more mercantile than idealistic. International institutions like the United Nations either do not exist or are far weaker. The absence of American leadership means fewer global rules-based norms. The World Bank, IMF, and WTO are either European-led or never emerge in their current form. Global development proceeds unevenly, with greater influence from former empires, not post-colonial liberal democracies. In Asia, Japan rises more assertively, facing fewer early constraints. Its expansionist ambitions in China and Southeast Asia go largely unchallenged in the 1930s and 40s, potentially leading to an East Asian bloc under Japanese leadership. This creates future rivalries with India, Australia, and a cautious United States monitoring Pacific trade routes. China's trajectory depends on whether its internal revolution succeeds. Without American and Soviet pressure, it might develop into a fragmented federation of warlord states or a nationalist autocracy. Today, the world is less interconnected, more regional, and more multipolar. Alliances are transactional. Trade exists, but global supply chains are less extensive. Ideologies are less universal. Nationalism and cultural identity dominate global discourse. Human rights are localized principles, not international law. Climate change cooperation is more fragmented, lacking the centralized global governance structures established in our world. The digital revolution occurs, but its scope is narrower. Surveillance is common, but often employed by regional powers in defense of their own models of order. And yet, despite all this, the world remains at peace, at least in the sense that no single global war has erupted in 100 years. The absence of total war may have spared millions, but it also delayed the moral reckonings and revolutions that war often forces upon societies. Without a universal enemy, the world has no universal memory, no defining never again to bind nations together. History proceeds more cautiously, more conservatively, and more slowly, but also more uncertainly. The United States, never forged in the fire of world war, is powerful but not dominant. Europe remains divided in vision. Asia rises, shaped by its own imperial legacies. The world, spared some of the worst horrors of the 20th century, finds itself instead entangled in a quieter, colder struggle. Not of survival, but of identity, of competing futures, none preordained.